Hey everyone. Will and I were lucky to have the opportunity to sit down with Jay Mahler for this interview on March 15th, 2021, right before he started chemo. He passed away on May 15th of this year. We are incredibly saddened by his passing and loved him so much. He helped so many people, brought about so much change, and he will be dearly missed.
Welcome to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall, and today my guest is Jay Mahler. Jay is one of the originators of the psychiatric survivor movement. He's been an activist and leader in the movement since the mid-'60s, and it's a tremendous honor to have you on the show today. Jay Mahler, welcome to Madness Radio.
Thank you. It's good to be here, and thank you for the privilege.
And I also want to welcome Dina Tyler. Dina is a longtime colleague of Jay and a friend of the show. You can listen to an interview with Dina on Madness Radio from our archives. And Dina is going to be joining me today in co-hosting the show and being part of the interview with Jay. So welcome to Madness Radio, Dina Tyler.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here with you both.
Yeah, it really is an honor to be here with you, Jay. I mean, you are one of the most important figures in the psychiatric survivor movement. Your impact has been tremendous. Everything about the recovery movement, everything about the psychiatric survivor movement has been shaped in part by your activism, which has now been going on for, I guess, more than 40, 50 years. So what I want to do is just hand it over to Dina and have you introduce Jay more fully. So take it away, Dina.
So I met Jay when I first came into working in mental health from the other side. I had been a recipient of mental health services and then got hired because I saw a job description that said, person with lived experience preferred, meaning that all my life experience being in the hospital and medicated and everything was actually a job qualification. And not too long after I got hired into this position, I found out that Jay Mahler, who was the Alameda County Consumer Relations Manager for the county, wanted to meet with me. And this was incredible because I had, from the outside, when I went to UC Berkeley, been studying the consumer survivor ex-patient movement. I had been learning the history, saw, Madness Network news, came across Jay Mahler's name and, what he had done. But then to have this opportunity to meet this hero that I had just only read about was just incredible. That wanted to meet me. And Jay, sat down with me, shared some of his story, provided an opportunity for me to share my story, which I hadn't, been able to do much, like actually share my story. And then Jay, it was you who then advocated to my boss at the time, who really didn't know, like they had hired somebody with lived experience, but didn't really know what to do with me and how to utilize me. And you advocated that I be sent to the alternatives conference. And that was the first time I started to meet other people from the movement. And you really opened up for me to meet everybody that I know. That was the first time, that alternatives conference, that I saw Will speak. And I met so many people through you, and it just absolutely changed my life. And I've always, just looked at you as such a great mentor. And I just, wanted to thank you for doing all that you do, and this opportunity today to share with everybody about your life's work. So just wanted to start off with that personal note of, how much you mean to me.
And how much that means to all of us, because the meeting that you two had, I mean, Dina, you went on and did your own path-breaking work and became named Peer Specialist of the Year, I think, a few years ago. So you've also had a tremendous influence in the San Francisco Bay Area and nationally, and Jay is your mentor. So
Absolutely. So Jay has been a long time just leader in Alameda County and California, and has built the largest network of people with lived experience in the entire world, called the Pool of Consumer Champions. And for many years worked in Alameda County as the Consumer Relations Manager, worked in Contra Costa County, building up peer-oriented, peer-run, recovery-oriented services there. So, Jay, I know you've done so much in your life, and I know I've probably left some things out, but, I just wanted to welcome you here to Madness Radio and turn it over to you. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you, Dina. You bringing tears to my eyes. I really appreciate that, and I love you very much. And thank you for sharing that. I guess one thing I'd like to clarify is that I spent 57 years with the public mental health system, 10 years trying to survive it, and 47 years trying to change it. So it was really in 1972 that I first got involved in the consumer survivor movement.
After being in the system for 10 years?
Yeah. Well, there's a little overlap there because I was actually referred to this Eden District Mental Health Committee while I was still an outpatient committee. So that was after 8 years in treatment, I got involved in the consumer movement in 72.
So people who don't know the history, I mean, this is the beginnings of the modern psychiatric survivor movement. There was no recovery as a concept. There were no peer specialists. There was no lived experience being recognized. So this is really the beginning of the very beginning. And Jay, when we talked with you about this interview, you said, well, remind me to get started in 1964. And for people who know West Coast history and San Francisco Bay Area history, 1964 is a very important year because there was something that got started called the free speech movement. And apparently that affected you very significantly. So maybe we should just start the story there, Jay?
Well, I may go a little bit before that because actually my childhood leading up to that was very significant. I lived in a working class neighborhood. Our family wasn't that well off, but I was very much a product of white privilege. I lived in a Latino neighborhood, and I can remember how I was always the class president. I was always the person that got all the attention from the teachers who were all white. And so in 1964, as I just graduated from high school, I started that summer getting involved with trying to end discrimination in housing for African Americans. There was a proposition on the ballot called Yes on 14, which was originated by the realtors who were trying to discriminate against African Americans. And that's actually how Ronald Reagan got his start. He was actually the chairperson of the Yes on 14 on the side of the realtors. So Ronald Reagan's been a nemesis of mine for a long, long time. But anyway, so in 64, when I was started Cal Berkeley, I really went through a worldview change. My life, as I knew at that time, my ego, my white privilege, it was being challenged by what I was seeing at Cal Berkeley in that summer before. So when I started at Cal Berkeley and was working at a table at Sather Gate to try and not prevent the school from moving our tables to an obscure part of campus. That was really the free speech. They wanted to take all the political tables and move them. And so I organized a petition to try and make sure that No on 14 would prevail. And so my worldview really was challenged, and what had worked for me in the past in terms of being an asshole, I guess in terms of my white privilege, was no longer workable for me. And so that really was a main thrust of why I think I had a nervous breakdown. It was going to Berkeley, being away from home for the first time. I was a real mama's boy, so it was hard being away from home, but really the worldview changed. And that was the main thing. I had a series of 3 breakdowns, altered states during that 64 through 66, where I was horribly treated by the hospitals. But another factor was my mom got cancer a year after I started Cal Berkeley and eventually died. So that was another major factor in why I had these experiences.
So your personal experience, your life is really interwoven with this incredible historic cataclysm that happened in the U.S. and especially in Berkeley and the San Francisco Bay Area, which was, as I understand it, I mean, this was before I was born, but just from reading and talking with people, that the civil rights movement really started to take off in the South and to get nationwide attention. And there was also this thing going on that no one was talking about, called the U.S. War in Vietnam. And as activists, as civil rights activists started to bring some of the activism into other parts of the country, I think that there were folks at UC Berkeley, students who had been down in the South organizing. Then, and this is 1960s, okay, so in 1964 at UC Berkeley, it was forbidden to do political organizing. You couldn't just set up a table at Sather Gate, Sproul Plaza, which is now totally political, lots of tables, but you couldn't just set it up. And so here you guys were saying, hey, we want to do this this campaign to stop this rent, this discriminatory rent proposal that Ronald Reagan is behind, and Prop 14, and they tried to stop you. And that was part of what the repression against political speech, really, that we understand it now. We take it for granted now. But at that moment, it ignited a huge activist movement with Mario Savio, with all these activists who said, no, we want to have the right to organize, and we want to have the right to organize and speak about this thing called the U.S. War in Vietnam. And then when that got rolling, now you start to have these huge, huge waves of protest around the country and also around the world against the Vietnam War. Now, of course, we know today that that was tremendously influential, had a huge impact on world history, U.S. history, and there you were at ground zero of when that is starting, also at the ground zero of the start of the psychiatric survivor movement. So it's really, and one of the things about people, when I talk to people about you and I say, hey, well, you know, there's all these different people that you may have heard about in the movement. There's this guy that I know about, Jay Mahler. People don't really know about you so much. And that's why I was so interested in doing this interview with you, because that is really part of your style as an activist and as a leader and as an organizer, is that you get in there and you make these personal connections. You're not doing a lot of like flashy media work. You're not doing a lot of like high visibility leadership in the public view, but you are down in there doing this work and having tremendous influence on people like Dina Tyler. So I can imagine all those different forces coming together, and then also this personal tragedy with your mom really pressurized you. So can you tell us, like you said that you had these breakdowns, what is it that kind of led up to them, and what were these altered states breakdowns about?
Well, let me go a little bit further. I just want to set the record straight from my understanding. So there were tables at Sather Gate. I mean, there were a number of tables. What the campus was going to do was to move them to an obscure part of the campus that would get little attention. And
exposure, yeah.
But the thing that I was very involved with was around the racism and those issues. And actually at that time, Nolan, who owned the Oakland Tribune, was a former senator, was Goldwater's campaign manager, and he was putting pressure on the UC system to stop the activity going on, because they were protesting about the racial discrimination at the Oakland Tribune. That's the part that I was most familiar with. I think that might have been a little bit before the Vietnam got all the emphasis, because again, I was mainly working on the discrimination and not so much familiar with the Vietnam stuff, although it was going on, but not to the degree it eventually became.
Well, that moment you're describing is really the bridge between the civil rights movement and the Vietnam, the anti-war movement. Yeah,
exactly.
So incredibly important moment in history, and there you are, right in the middle. I have to say that Ronald Reagan is kind of my nemesis too. I ended up in California in 1980, I guess it was 1983, and Reagan was, I guess, reelected, and he was always our big number one enemy. So we both have him as a bit of a kind of a shadow looming over us.
My first public speech at the state capitol was in 1974. I was still in outpatient treatment, but I think an important thing you need to know is when I first got involved in 1972, I got involved in the Eden District Mental Health Committee. And that Eden District Mental Health Committee, my mentor was this woman named Gail Still, who was very open to my story and listening to what I had to say. And she eventually became a board of supervisor. We were very well connected. And so that Eden District Committee was made up of a number of perspectives, family, provider, consumer. And so I started out being open to hearing other points of view and trying to work with them if they agreed with what I was trying to do. And I think that's a big difference between a lot of people in the movement at that time, because they were very much wanting to abolish the whole public mental health system. They wouldn't talk with mental health providers. And I think that really opened the door for me to be involved in a lot of things that other people at the time didn't have a chance to be involved with, because I would be asked by these people, and we'll get into more of that in the future.
So from your being at Cal in 64, how did you end up in the system?
Okay. Well, I was organizing this petition. I had this idea of getting 20,000 signatures, to stop Reagan and his and the realtors, and I went about 7 days without any sleep. And so as I was making these important realizations about life, because again, this wasn't just about political, it was also a spiritual experience for me, as well as other things. And so as I was making these realizations about life, I wanted to go tell my parents about these realizations. And so I was running home from Berkeley to home, about 30 miles away. I wanted to run over there and tell them what I just realized, and got as far as this Lake Temescal, which was like a pretty warm late October day. And I decided I'd go and take a swim in the nude in this Lake Temescal, and there were quite a few people there. But even before that, I saw this yellow poodle that was tied to a tree. I mean, not a yellow poodle. It was a poodle with a yellow ribbon on it. And I thought God had put that poodle there to lead me home. And unfortunately, the owner didn't agree with me, as I started to take her poodle away. So that's what caused the ambulance to be called. And I ended up going to Cal Hospital. Now, that was interesting.
So you were an early animal liberationist and nudity activist, it sounds like.
Yeah, I guess so. So anyway, so from there, I went back to Cal, and they had a hospital there. And this is interesting, because at the hospital, as I was staying there for a few nights, I saw this person in this iron lung. And I don't know if you ever heard the name Ed Roberts.
Doesn't ring a bell.
Well, Dina may have heard him. In California, he was like in charge of the department of rehab, some kind of cerebral palsy. So he had something that he was in his room doing an iron lung. So I went and saw him, and he was using this thing that was in his mouth to turn the pages. So I saw him there. I wanted to read to him. So I would go and read to Ed Roberts to try and help him with his studies. Then in 1984, when Justin Dart pulled together all the various perspectives, Justin Dart, he was in charge of the employment handicap. He had Ed Roberts. Ed Roberts is quite famous. I mean, real famous in California. And saw Ed Roberts there, and I told him, I reminded him about how I helped him when I was reading to him at Cal Berkeley, and he kind of surprised me, because he didn't take it that way. He thought I was a nuisance. It bothered him.
Yeah.
So that's another story, but yeah.
So you're really, really intertwined with the disability rights movement as well.
Well, not to the degree Judy Chamberlain was, but somewhat. Yeah.
You got extremely excited in organizing against Ronald Reagan, like a lot of us did, and you don't sleep, and you have this wild experience. You said it was very spiritual. Tell us. I mean, I have a hint of it with the swimming naked and the connection with the dog. But what is tell us about the spiritual angle there.
Well, I think, again, my worldview was changing. Life was not working for me. And so each time I've had this altered state, it's usually because my self is out of touch spiritually, body and mind. And with spirituality, I felt a strong sense that I had important lessons that I learned in life against materialism, how to love people, how to not be in the world, but to be more in spiritual. And I took that. I mean, I had such as high experiences. I took on the image of thinking I was Christ, for example. And so I really felt I had an important message to give the world. Yeah.
You were right, it sounds like.
Yes, I think I was right. I was a little out of touch with it, but I don't quite think I'm Christ anymore, but I do think I have Christ. ideas in my mind. Yeah,
I think that's a good direction.
I'm actually working on Christianity and science in mind. There's two spiritual things that are important to me.
Well, yeah, I'd be interesting to get more into that. But it sounds like, I mean, you didn't just spend overnight in a psych hospital. You weren't just locked up for a week and then they let you go. These are back in the days when you get pulled into the system and they pretty much throw away the key. You can get lost in the system for many, many, many years. And it sounds like that's what happened to you.
Well, not quite that, not quite that much, but it is true that 80%, I mean, people were committed based on two psychiatrists saying they had a mental disorder, and people were in there for months, years, and decades. The longest time I was in there was like 4 or 5 months, and always picked up by the police, handcuffed, thrown to the ground, taken to the local hospital. And that began a nightmare of, at that time, you had no rights at all, to have visitors, to refuse shock treatments, to get out of the hospital. It was all based on the psychiatrist making the decision. So, for example, the last time I was in the hospital during those 3 years, I was at Langley Porter. But anyway, so I was given shock treatments against my will, in restraints for days at a time, seclusions a week at a time, had no rights to have visitors, telephone calls, wear my own clothes. These were all privileges that you had to earn over time. So again, for me, the longest was like 4.5 months. And I can remember when I was being released after the 4.5 months, I have my records from my chart. It was actually the patient rights advocate for San Francisco was able to help me get my records. And I was pleased that the last day I was at Langley Porter, I refused to make my bed, which showed that I still had a spirit of non-compliance with me, because I think that's a key.
Yeah.
And when I mentioned Lenny Frank actually took my papers from Langley Porter. I had all my records, and he actually put together a story in Langley Porter that quoted my records. So I had a good sense about how horrible that was. I remember one time in the chart, it says, talking to the nurse, and I was saying to her I was being reborn. And she asked me, she said, "What does that mean?" I said, "Never mind, you wouldn't understand anyway." So that was my answer to her. But then there were other things in the chart. For example, like they made everything a abnormal behavior. And so there's a thing in the chart where it showed I mixed my chili beans with my peaches, and I actually thought that would make you fart less. So that's why I did that, but they thought that was pretty abnormal.
So they decided that you were schizophrenic, or they decided that you were some
label. Yeah. Oh, here you go. Yeah. At age 20, I was my diagnosis. I was diagnosed as chronic schizophrenia, undifferentiated with prognosis poor, because I didn't respond well to the shock treatments. So I've actually had 5 different labels by 4 different doctors over the years. Besides chronic schizophrenia, I had paranoid schizophrenia, had psychothymic personality disorder, manic depressive disorder. The only one that made sense was adjustment reaction to adulthood. I could relate to that one, starting Berkeley.
Reaction to adult. Yeah, I can relate. I think a lot of people can relate to that one. And you really kind of got the full force of the system coming against you back in the days before there were protections, before there were court hearings, before there was patients' rights advocates, before there was like a human rights officer. This is like before the movement put in all these reforms and protections. You were having extended restraints, extended seclusion, forced electroshock, you repeated hospitalizations, forced picking up by the police. I mean, some of these things still happen today, but this is really when the movement hadn't quite made the reforms and the changes that it did. And so the full force of it came against, and you had been a political activist and you're having these spiritual experiences, and but it didn't break you.
Well, it did for quite a while, because the last time I got out of the hospital, a little sad for me. You can't help but still get upset. The last time I got out of the hospital, I had such a low self-image. I'd gone from Jay Mahler being a human being to Jay Mahler being a mental patient. And I go home and I slept 20 hours a day for over the year, avoided people at all costs, had a horrible self-image. So it really was a devastating experience after that. And I would actually go in and see a psychiatrist, started out maybe once every 2 weeks, and then ended up being once every 3 months, where I'd just pick up this big bottle of pills, meet with him about 10 minutes, sometimes would talk what it was like to not to have friends, but mostly just pick up the pills. And thank God there was a funding cut in Alameda County where this psychiatrist I was seeing every 3 months lost his job. And so in order for me to, and again, I was hooked on the medications at that time. In order for me to get the medications, I had to join this group and met this Dr. Moore, who was very eclectic. I mean, I was in his group for about 5 years. We did things like Janoff's Primal Scream, Marino Psychodrama, Fitzpearls, things like that. But most importantly, I had a chance to be in with other people that had lived experience. And so I started socializing, going out more, talking to people, lost my virginity there. That was really important. And so ended up starting to live again. Yeah.
Wow. So you really, it was kind of almost a stroke of luck. The funding ran out. They switched you. Now you're in a group and you get exposed to some of these like human potential, Gestalt, Primal Screen stuff. But it sounds like the key thing was now you had other patients, other people who'd been in the system to be friends with. It sounds like that was really the turning point for you. Is that right?
Yeah. And it was Dr. Moore encouraged me to go back to school and major in psychology. And he also encouraged me to get into this Eden District Mental Health Committee, which really started my time in the movement in 72.
Okay. Incredible. So Dina, do you have any questions or thoughts you want to add or?
Yeah, Jay, I was wondering if you could share more about what it was like to go through so many shock treatments and then your advocacy work around electroshock.
Well, it's probably the most terrifying experience was going through shock treatment. And there's a part that they call the confusion state. And what it is, you're completely without memory. Didn't know who I was, where I was, my name, complete memory loss. I mean, it's very terrifying. And I can remember as I was going into this confusion state, and actually I found out that my dad actually signed the consent for my shock treatments. You know, him being a truck driver, he didn't really know how to challenge the system. And he had signed for him. And because the law was a minor wasn't an adult until 21. Now it's 18 with the new amendment. At that time it was your parents that made the decisions. But anyway, so I can remember as I was getting into this horrible confusion state that I was standing in the hallway saying, I don't want any more of this. And then this Amos Fisher felt like a wounded deer in front of the headlights. When I said I wasn't going to do it, he and the rest of the people that were with him came and they literally tackled me and took me to the shock room. Now, it's an interesting story about Amos Fisher that I'll just share with you because you asked about the work on shock treatments. There was a bill by Vasconcellos who actually was successful in requiring that there be regulations for shock treatments. And this is back now, probably 1975, that I was involved with the Eden District Mental Health Committee. And at that time, the mental health director was Dr. Mendel, who was a first female psychologist in the state that was a mental health director. Up until 1974, all the mental health directors in California, 57 of them, were all white male psychiatrists. So you can get a sense of the power of the medical model. So anyway, she invited me to go to a State Department of Health hearing because I was involved with mental health consumers concerns. It must have been 1977. And I knew her because I've been working with her. She invited me to go to this meeting on the regulations. And at the meeting, there were two people from the Department of Health. There was myself and Dr. Mendel and one other person from MHCC. And the 7 or 8 other people there were all shock doctors from throughout the state that were writing the regulations, including Dr. Amos Fisher, who was the shock doctor that shocked me. And I can remember seeing his name when he introduced himself. And I don't swear publicly very often, but I said, oh, shit. I remember Dr. Mendel putting her finger over her mouth, trying to get me to be quiet. But there was Amos Fisher, there was Gunnar Smith from Stockton, the guy that was shocking minors at Berkeley. These were all people writing the regulations. So you get a sense about how people maintain the status quo, keeping their power. I mean, you really I got a good picture of how the system doesn't work that day. Oh, let me just share one more story. Carl Jung was pretty much into spirituality. So in the late 70s, mid 70s, I went to a workshop on schizophrenia as a growth experience at San Anselmo Seminary in Marin County. And the guest speaker there was Howard Levine. And Howard Levine is a person that started Diabolus' House with John Perry, very much a Jungian anti-medical model kind of thing. Howard Levine shared with me that he had worked at Langley Porter when he believed in the medical model and quit that job. So I had a chance to talk with him afterwards, and he turned out that he was the psychiatrist that was supervising Dr. Khalil, who was the one that prescribed the shock treatments. And he literally apologized to me for what I'd been through at Langley Porter in the name of the medical model. So that was a very powerful story.
Wow, that's incredible. So that one of your first advocacy experiences, you go up to the committee and you find out that one of your shock doctors is not just a shock doctor. He's actually on the regulatory committee, and now you're advocating. And then you do this work to connect with the spiritual side of your experience. And then here's one of your other psychiatrists, but now he's actually changed his tune and he apologizes to you. So again, it's this it's this thread in your work, Jay, where I see that you're at these really crucial moments and you meet really crucial people and you have all these different kinds of meetings at these intersections.
Well, this is where I get a little out of touch, because I really believe if you're on your right path in life, these things happen to you. It's not just by chance. It's, I guess, synchronicity or science of mind. I mean, I really believe that the things like that will happen if you're doing what you need to be doing.
Do you want to ask another question, Dina? Because I think we're right at the point where you start your work with advocacy. Maybe you want to say more about that, or do you want to ask more? Because you had asked about the electroshock experience, or there's other hospital experiences.
Yeah, there was two backup questions, going back to the hospital experiences that I was wondering if you wanted to share. The first one, Jay, is around shock treatment. I believe you had mentioned before that you were shocked so many times that your heart actually stopped.
No.
Oh.
No, 14 times. And it was interesting. At that time, they were doing a experiment to find out how much memory loss she had versus unilateral placement of the what do we call it, the shock thing versus bilateral two places they enter the shock. And I can remember there was a psychologist that was measuring memory loss, and you'd go in to his room and he had a machine where you would try and remember 10 green lights by pressing one of two buttons. You had to get correct 10 times, something a monkey could probably do in a short period of time. But I was going through the shock treatment, I could spend a half hour there and could never get the 10 green lights. It was an effort to check how your memory loss. So that was a devastating part, complete memory loss. The thing that did happen to me that wasn't so much the shock treatment was because I was on over 2,000 milligrams of Thorazine. Now, that's a huge amount of Thorazine. You don't recommend more than 800. I was given 2,000. I actually had grand mal seizures from the Thorazine. That's why they switched me to Trilofan. So that was a pretty terrifying experience, walking down the hall and just going into a grand mal seizure.
It's awful. Jay, so you were this bright young man that got a lot of attention, as class president, a lot of attention from teachers, known for your intellect. How was it for you to then go into the hospital where no one's listening to you and your voice?
Well, I mean, it's pretty devastating because they wouldn't listen or do anything. And I couldn't challenge anything. I couldn't disagree. I couldn't give my point of view. It was all done to me, not anything with my involvement. So it was very hard to be in that place and to not be able to even have basic rights like having your family visit you or to make telephone calls or to even wear your own clothes. I mean, all those things were playing havoc with me becoming a mental patient. They were teaching me that I didn't have any say, that I had no wisdom, that I had no insight.
And while you were in the system experiencing this, was there something inside of you that said, okay, I'm going to start advocating, I'm going to start speaking up, I'm going to start organizing for change, just like you were around the rent issue and Reagan? And
I really didn't do that until after I was laying at home, thinking, laying in my bed 20 hours a day for over a year. I mainly was trying to help connect with other people and try and support other people that were in the hospital with me. Yeah, it's interesting. The one person that came in, I was maybe 19, 20 at the time. The last time there was a person that came in that was 17 or 18, was about to go through shock treatments. And years later, I met him. He was in a program, and we reconnected. And I was a little sad because he had really took on the mental patient role, and it didn't seem like he had recovered much.
So you were kind of by luck brought into this group, and you got to expose to these different things, and there was some support, and there started to be a connection, and you were encouraged to go back to school. And at what point did you really say, okay, now I'm going to be in the movement. Now I'm going to really be an activist and an advocate? And what did you learn, and what kinds of things were you doing? What were some of the high points of being an activist?
Yeah, so again, and maybe I shouldn't count this as being part of the movement, but because I got involved in the Eden District Mental Health Committee in '72 and learning a lot about the public mental health system, going to Sacramento, lobbying for things as part of the citizen group. So that really was the thing that learned a lot about the movement. And I'm not about the movement. I learned a lot about the public mental health system.
Was that the group that had the different stakeholders? So you learned to work with professionals as well as family members? Yeah.
Yeah, there was various perspectives there. Yeah. So that really taught me to maybe be open to listening to other points of view. And again, as I said, is if they agreed with what I'm saying, I felt okay about working with them. And as we talk more, you're going to see how I had an advantage of being asked to do a lot of things that other people didn't in the movement didn't have, because they were trying to abolish the system. I believed in abolishing the system, but I still would talk to people.
Which is probably a more effective way of abolishing the system, actually.
Well, we'll talk about that. I think it was. You'll see what I'm saying. So in '74, for example, my first speech at Sacramento was when Reagan was cutting the budget. I was asked to do that because I had connected with this Assemblyman Tom Bates. So, and at that time, there was only 2 or 3 of us that were involved in trying to change the system of consumer survivors. There was only 2 or 3 in the whole state. So I kept being asked to do these things. And I had a lot of energy at that time, the amazing amount of energy I had when I started getting out of that mental patient role. And all this energy had built up from sleeping 20 hours a day. It was being unleashed.
How did that happen? Did you start reducing your medications, or what was it that got you? Did you get off the Thorazine, or how did you kind of transition to being alive again?
I think there's something resilient about the human spirit, that over time there's a healing thing. They were reducing the amount of medications. I was on, I think, started off with 192 milligrams of Trilofan. That's equivalent to 2,000 of Thorazine. Got down to maybe where I was only on 4 or 5 milligrams. In fact, it was my wife, Susan, that says, "Why are you still taking this stuff?" And so she's the one that talked me out of stopping it. And thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, thank you, Susan. She's right there. Thank you, Susan.
Yeah. And so besides getting lower on the medication and the resilience of the human spirit, going back to school and majoring in psychology, studying Jung and Maslow and Rogers and Marina, that was very helpful.
Back in the days when psychology was actually interesting and humanistic and oriented around people.
Oh, it was this Janov Primal Scream, and they were pretty fantastic. And then I think getting the job, I got a job through Kelly Girls. My mom had passed away, but a friend of hers worked for Kelly Girls. And
that was like the temp agency, right? Kelly Girls?
Yeah, for women. But anyway, I snuck in there.
So you're an early feminist too, is that's what I'm hearing?
I guess so.
You didn't know it at the time.
Although I didn't know at the time, but Kelly Girls, the person that Velma, who worked for them, got me this job at this drugstore, which was actually named Drug King. I certainly felt I was a drug king because I was sleeping all these hours and having to sleep during my lunch break.
Your life is like a dream. There's all these strange synchronicities and things going on. So your first job when you were over medicated was working at a place called Drug King when you were on 2,000 milligrams of Thorazine.
Well, let me tell you another story. I have so many stories. So Drug King was started by the Rexall family, by
Justin Dart?
Yes. Justin Dart's father was part of Reagan's kitchen cabinet.
Oh.
And it was Justin Dart. I remember having a chance to first meet him in 1984, and I told him how much Drug King had helped me, because it really did,
Just having a job, just having a little job.
That job was important. Yes.
Yeah, I had some really basic jobs that were really important for me too. Working at a convenience store and working in a bookstore are really crucial moments.
I worked for 5 years there. I was paying my way through college. Yeah.
Yeah. What are some other stories from that time?
Yeah, let's start with the movement.
I would love to know, the early gatherings that you went to with the movement, like alternatives, was at campgrounds and, other meetings that you had.
Well, the earliest one I went to was before I really got started in the movement, was in 1974. They had an annual conference on human rights and psychiatric oppression. And I didn't really know what I was getting myself into, but I saw an ad in the newspaper. It was at a college for nudes or something. I mean, it was some kind of art school or art thing over in San Francisco. So I went over there and got to where they had the registration. And there was a guy there. I think it was a guy that was a psychiatrist who was pretty well known on trying to be against shock treatment. And I told him I was here and I'd like to go into this meeting, And he said, I wouldn't go in there like right now. They're fighting like mad. And there was a meeting where the professionals and the patients were fighting at each other. Patients wanting to get rid of the professionals. And I'm hearing all this yelling. So I didn't have the courage to go in there. I just went home after talking to this guy. But that was my first effort to try and get involved in the movement.
I think a lot of people have had that experience, actually. Jay, they get turned away at the door because of all the fighting. But that's so interesting. And I love that it was called Human Rights and Psychiatric Oppression. That was the name of the conference. Why don't we have conferences?
Yeah, Human Rights and Against Psychiatric
Oppression. Yeah, why don't we have conferences named like that these days? We've sort of lost a lot of the sharp bite of the movement has been dulled and sandpapered down, I think. So
1976 is when I first really gotten started in the movement. And at that time, I went up to a meeting in Sacramento where all the mental health communities spoke. And the keynote speaker was Jerome Lackner, who was in charge of the Department of Health, Mental Health at the time. And he was Cesar Chavez's personal physician. He was a pretty progressive guy. And he was announcing that after 7 years of having the LPS passed in 1969, you finally had regulations that were going to require each county to have a patient rights advocate. And so at that moment, I was thinking, why can't a group of former patients be the patient rights advocate for Alameda County?
Mm-hmm.
And so I decided to form a group called Mental Health Consumer Concerns, which actually was based on kind of Nader, consumer rights. And at that time, the movement wasn't the most colorful name when you had groups like Network Against Psychiatric Assault or Mental Patients Liberation Front. But for me, it was Mental Health Consumer Concerns. And the hope was to be the patient rights advocate for Alameda County. So at that time, each mental health director had to appoint a patient rights advocate. And so in our county, the mental health director appointed Dr. York, who was the psychiatrist in charge of the inpatient unit and the psych emergency, to be the patient rights advocate.
Yeah, they're still playing games like that where they appoint the foxes to guard the chicken house. Yes. That hasn't changed very much, doesn't sound like.
Well, I think it has quite a bit, actually, somewhat.
Well, that's
sure.
a good question. We should talk about that. What the change? Yeah. But let's keep going with the historical part.
Yeah. So anyway, for 4 or 5 years, tried to be the patient rights advocate through mental health consumer concerns in Alameda County, but there was no way they were going to hire a group of former patients to be the patient rights advocate.
Right.
And again, I developed a relationship with Gail Bataille, and the mental health director for Contra Costa County was a person named Don Goldmacher, who was actually involved with Network Against Psychiatric Assault. It was disappointing because I had to leave Alameda County, but after 4 or 5 years, 1980, we got the contract to be the patient rights advocate for Contra Costa County. Now, during that period from 76 to 1980, I was very active in the movement because I was working on patient rights and studying the laws and really becoming quite knowledgeable on that, putting a tremendous amount of hours into knowing that, probably 60 hours a week just to try and get MHCC going. I had a chance to work for the National Paralegal Institute. They had a small contract with MHCC. We didn't have any big contracts, and that was to train 6 states in patient rights law. And so first trained California and New Jersey, and then we had a big meeting in 1979 where they trained 4 states. I think it was Massachusetts, Tennessee, Ohio, blanking on the other states. But anyway, that was interesting. Another story, when I got there for the training in Nashville, they were having the largest KK rally in 50 years. And they were at the same hotel that we were at. And when we got there,
think that maybe that might not be a good mix to.
Well, at that time, the court had met on Sunday, and because they had registered on a fictitious name, they could no longer have their conference there. And so here were all these people in these white robes as we got there on Sunday, protesting at the hotel. Our event didn't start there Tuesday, but the trainers got there early. And so they were actually, I went to where their exhibit was being set up. They were giving out 4 automatic rifles as their prize And so anyway, that was actually a significant event because it was the whole thing. It was that's how I started, was working on trying to end discrimination for African Americans. Here you have this largest KK rally. And it was on my plane trip home that I heard this voice of God saying I had fulfilled my commitment to him. When I was at Highland Hospital one time, getting back to the spirituality, probably in the 60s, 65, 66, I'm in the seclusion room. I'm on my hand and knees praying to God if he'd help me, I would try and help other people. And I had this white light experience. They call it a Kundalini awakening, where I felt the presence of God, and it was quite meaningful for me. And then here I am at coming back from the National Paralegal Institute, where I'm on this plane, 1980, and heard the voice of God saying I fulfilled my commitment to him. That started another altered state of consciousness. So anyway, so going back to being involved in the movement. So in 1976, as I started getting involved in the movement, I was involved in 1978 with the National Paralegal Institute. In 1977, Tom Bates, assemblyman at the time, and his staff person, Joan Almondson, they were having a hearing on the public mental health system, and they wanted me to organize a group of former patients, current patients, to speak at the hearing. So at that time, we formed a group called Coalition Against Forced Treatment. So we got Psychiatric Inmates Rights Collective, Network Against Psychiatric Assault, People's Rights Organization, Mental Health Consumer Organizations. All the organizations in the Bay Area, we got together and formed CAF, which existed about 3 or 4 years. Did a lot of patient rights training, did a lot of lobbying. 1979-80, it was CAF that put on the 8th Annual Conference on Human Rights and Psychiatric Oppression in Berkeley, and we protested against the APA at their annual meeting in San Francisco. Now, that was an interesting experience for me because I had been involved with mental health consumer concerns. We played a major role in trying to organize the conference, and a couple people, David Oakes and Lenny Lapone, wanted me banned from the conference, NIMH, that funded the National Paralegal Institute. And so that was kind of a statement about how many people in the movement really wanted to abolish the system and didn't want us to get money from them. So that hurt a little bit. But again, because I was the organizer and that, they didn't ban me from it, but it was a little hurtful. That was just another story.
Because of the question, the politics of funding.
Yeah.
Some people who were like totally against any kind of funding at all, and other people who were in favor of getting some funding. But that's sort of, what do you think that means looking back? Do you think that the movement has run into problems with co-optation and money being a corrupting influence?
Oh yeah, they sure have. I mean, it's a big issue, and I certainly feel like at times working for Contra Costa County and Alameda County and in the really administrative role, I felt I met the enemy and it was me. I mean, it's really is a challenge to not be co-opted. I've met so many people who co-opted, and I've probably been co-opted some myself and maybe not aware of it as much as I should be. But anyway, yeah, it was a strong point. They had a very good point. We're working on patient rights. I mean, we're working on trying to set up programs for the system. We're trying to stop the system. So I felt being it was in patient rights.
Well, what do you think has changed looking, because you're very much involved with activism these days and collaborating with different organizers and younger people in the movement. How do you think it compares now, looking back to the 70s and early 80s and when the movement came in and made all these changes? Because on the one hand, there are big changes, but on the other hand, some of the changes are for the worse. There's a lot more people on medications now. Yeah. There's a lot more people with diagnosis now. Psychiatry has sort of like infiltrated the whole society in a lot of ways, even though maybe some of the more extremes of the inpatient hospital experience. But then you have these community programs that are kind of like hospitals without walls, and it's just heavy medications, and you're a mental patient and you're supposed to work, but you're supposed to be under this identity and a label and take your meds. And how do you sort of, because your perspective is such a long perspective, how do you see the changes that have taken place? What's better? What's not better?
Yeah, well, I feel we're in a mode where we've taken a couple step backwards, and I feel the idealism, the radicalism, the spirit of the movement and the dedication to it was much stronger. I hope it's true with youth, but I see a lot of people that don't feel as passionate or as strong about changing the system. Now, maybe I'm not around the right people, because I'm sure there are a lot of passionate people. I mean, I meet a lot of passionate people. I just felt it was more stronger back then. I guess maybe I'm wrong, but I felt that way.
I think you make a point. I think back then there was a lot of volunteerism.
Oh, yeah.
There were a lot of people who were just involved because they were passionate about it. And now you have people who are sort of involved, but they also are paid.
Right.
They're employees, they're staff people, they're part of programs. And that's how they first get involved in the movement, is through these moneyed paid position, which is not to be against that, but it's a different kind of motivation. It's not a passion motivation.
I think so. It takes a lot of hard work and passion. Like I said, 40, 50, 60 hours of volunteer work. Now I'm putting 25 hours a week of volunteer just on the police removal. But yeah, I think people do have other needs they're trying to take care of. And
it also was an era where, I mean, you have the civil rights movement, you have the gay rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement. I mean, this is something that I always think about. How do you feel that the psychiatric patients movement was influenced by other social movements of the time? I mean, for you, clearly being out of the free speech movement, but what was the crossover with people sort of being influenced by different movements?
Oh, no question about it. I mean, we always saw our movement as a civil rights movement. In some ways, the last civil rights movement, because we've been kind of the tail end of the dog in terms of more discrimination. I'm not more, but I'm talking about people dying 25 years younger that are people with mental health issues, unemployment rate being 80%, homeless 40%. I mean, obviously people with mental health issues are having it extremely difficult. But the civil rights movement was always the inspiration for a lot of us, with the women's movement, the gay movement, the racial civil rights part of it. Yeah, so that's how we identify ourselves. I do feel I like to have hope. You don't always got to have hope. So I like to believe that with what Trump's done the last 4 years, that we'll see people rally against the oppression. And I certainly see it with the Black Lives Movement and the tragic deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the massive protests. This is probably the best time we ever had to remove police from being the first responders in a mental health crisis. Now, personally, I like to, the best way of getting rid of the police is to take them out of the LPS Act. Say they can no longer 5150 people. I don't think we'll get that far, but I think we're making a lot of progress that I see in this one area. So I think where you have the most opportunity is where you see the most oppression and most people being abused is where you can really rally people more.
And that's the LPS Act. That's in California, where they allow 5150.
California, yeah. That's what gives the authority to police to 5150 people and take them to hospitals. So all you have to do is just remove that authority and it's a done deal. But there's not the spirit for that. I don't think. We'll try, but I don't think we'll succeed.
So you would say that you're hopeful, Jay, for the future, or you're?
Well, I'm hopeful for the removing police. I'm hopeful for SB 803, the hiring of consumers. Yeah, I think I am hopeful. It's like when Reagan became president. I remember at that time, there were actually 4 of us that were the first consultants to NIMH in about 1979. That was Judy Chamberlain, myself, Ken Donaldson, who had been locked up by a hospital for 14 years, and Marcia Lovejoy. Again, this Lou Coppola, who was in charge of the patient rights, invited 4 of us to be involved in discussing how to improve patient rights. So I remember being in Washington, D.C. after Reagan had become president, and how we talked about how things are going to be rough over the next few years. And we're hoping that we had planted some seeds and they would grow again. But at that time, Carter and Rosalynn Carter had a President's Commission on Mental Health that had a lot of progressive legislation in it. A lot of movement people testified there. Judy Chamberlain was very involved with that. So that was dismantled by Reagan. He also cut back the amount of HUD programs from 100% to 25%. It did major damage on taking people off of public benefits, SSI. So I saw how things took a big step backwards, but then after he left, things started improving again. And so that's what I hope will happen with what's going on now with Trump no longer in office. The history seems to be repeating itself, although I think it's much worse now than Reagan.
Dina, do you have some more questions or thoughts you want to bring in?
Jay, you mentioned how in the beginning of your introduction to advocacy work, you were exposed to the provider's perspective, the family member's perspective, and those that have gone through it personally. And it's something I've always seen in you, that you have a way of advocacy around getting another person to see a new perspective. I was wondering if you would talk about some of any stories from years of advocacy of when you came up against a challenging person, a challenging perspective, and how you went about helping them see what you were talking about.
Well, I'm not sure I was successful against the hardened believers. There were family members that believed so strongly in shock treatment, or they believed so strongly in medication or locking people up. But usually the hardcore people, we each had our strong values. I guess being able to listen to them and not throw bricks at them was something I had to learn to do, or not swear at them. But I think the main success for me was working with people that really saw our point of view and wanted to do something about it. Even in the family movement, there were Carol Stone, who wrote this beautiful poem about how bad the public mental health system was and how much it ruined her son, or Dan Weisberg, who became president of NAMI, who asked me to be on the lieutenant governor's task force. There were people that weren't as adamant that were open to listening to us. And I've had so many experiences with that with providers. Gail Bataille, for example, who in Alameda County, we've been connected together since 1974. And she's the one that got the contract for MHCC in Contra Costa County. She's the one that hired Linford Gale. She's the one that set up a consumer group, and she became the mental health director for Solano County. She was probably the best friend mental health consumer concerns had. She got us our contract and really stood behind us when we encountered providers that were challenging. In every issue, whether it's hiring consumers, there were a number of mental health professionals that would write us off. Give me an example. Gail Bataille and I, back in, I guess it was 1989, SAMHSA had a grant to train peers to be mental health providers. It was based on the program in Denver, Colorado, the case management aid. So they had 2 grants that they wanted to have go out to consumer organizations. And so mental health consumer concerns, with the help of Gail Bataille, and we teamed up with Sacramento County, applied to be one of those grants. And we actually got $1,500,000 given to MHC and Contra Costa County over 3 years to try and train consumers in East County to be peer providers. And at the 11th hour, the professionals in East County didn't want to have the grant. They felt they would lose jobs. They were wondering, well, what if, can you rely on the peers? What if they had a breakdown? And they had all these red flags they brought up, and they went to the Board of Supervisors and were actually able to get them to turn back the grant, which is the first time a CSP grant would have been turned back after it was awarded. We had a campaign called Sing Our Song. I'm wearing one of the buttons for that right now. It meant save our national grant. So we tried to organize and save it, but there was no way you're going to defeat the hardcore professionals. So it's just an example of finding people that are like-minded, are willing to maybe not push the full distance that we want to go, but will meet us halfway, has been probably the way I've been most successful, and actually been included by, whether it's SAMHSA. I mean, just give a lot of examples where I had a chance to be involved in things that other people didn't, because I was willing to be open to people that were trying, but maybe not quite there yet.
So that's really remarkable. So that was actually a national grant. It sounds like the professionals felt so threatened by the idea of people who had been patients being providers that they actually blocked the grant, and actually they had to return the money. Is that what happened?
Well, it went to Sacramento, which was the other county that was applying for it. And actually, I was able to start working for Sacramento as a consultant to help implement it in Sacramento. But that was the first major time in California that we really pushed the issue of hiring consumers.
So they blocked it in one county, but it ended up getting successful in another county.
It was the professionals in Contra Costa.
Contra Costa County, yeah.
So that was a test of perseverance, because we kept wanting to do that. And that's where it's hard work. The movement people, you have to persevere. And so we applied for another grant done by the State Department of Mental Health. And in this case, we finished second, and they were only going to fund one grant. And so this is now 2 or 3 years later that finally the county fell for us, I guess, and they gave MHCC $30,000 to set up a program to hire consumers. And that's how we started what we called an office program that's now called Best Now. It's been operating since 1994. And that was a struggle trying to get that started on only $30,000 a year.
How did the pool for consumer champions get started?
So I was working as the administrator for part of the management team for Contra Costa County. Did that for 7 years. We'll talk about that for a while. But in 2006, there were actually, this is my Mahler image actually. In 2006, we had a team in Contra Costa County, Anna Labaroff, Aaron Kling, Sharon Keene, we were all part of the management team. There was a funding cut going on in Contra Costa County where the mental health director said I had to cut one of my positions, and they wanted me to let go of Anna Labaroff. And I think she knows this. But anyway, at the time I told Donna Wiegand I'd rather leave the job than letting go of Anna. So at that time, I inquired at Alameda County, and there was a deputy director there named Barbara Majak, who I actually knew from 1974. And Mary Thomas, who was the mental health director, was somebody I'd known for 20 years. And so they had made an effort to hire a consumer manager, but it didn't work out. And they told me there was an opening for that. And I told them, well, I would like to apply for it. And so they decided to hire me to be on their management team in Alameda County. The summer before I took the job, I read the Mental Health Service Act plan for community support services. This is a number of $1 million that we're going to set up mental health programs in the community. And the Mental Health Service Act, I was actually on, Sally and I were on Steinberg's committee to pass Mental Health Service Act. So I was very familiar with the law, very familiar that they were supposed to involve consumers in the law, have programs that would be consumer ran. And so when I read that plan the summer before I started, there was not one penny that went to consumer ran programs.
So let's just maybe back up just for a second. So the Mental Health Consumer Services Act, say what that was, and then basically you're telling the story of how it got twisted and the money got directed in the wrong directions.
Yeah. Mental Health Service Act was a ballot initiative, was called the Robin Hood Initiative. It was to rob from the rich and give to the poor. And basically it was taking 1% of every 0.5%, I think, maybe 1% of every millionaire's $1 million after the first million, and would have to go to mental health services. And so they had the first year
in California statewide, right?
$600 million.
It was successful. Yeah. It passed as a ballot initiative.
Again, they were largely passed for the wrong reason. They wanted to get the homeless outside out of mind. But anyway, there were some good reasons to pass it by some voters. But anyway, $600 million went to mental health services dollars. They had various programs. You started out with community services, then you were going into prevention, then you were going into workforce development. So they had various programs on when they were starting.
And the way it was written was quite progressive because it says the most innovative programs, peer services,
recovery oriented. There were consumers that were on the state council.
Exactly. It was very progressive on paper.
Yeah, and they had some good writing that was written by consumers that had to involve consumers, had to implement the recovery vision, had to go to voluntary services. So again, because we had been involved in citizen groups and working at the state level on boards, the California Network, as well as other peers, we were successful in getting some good writing in that. So that first summer after I read it, not one penny was going to consumer-run organizations, and yet they had $1 million going to the families group. So I figured what we needed to do, instead of agonizing over that, to organize. And I figured we really need to do some hard work. There wasn't a strong consumer movement advocating for dollars to go to consumer groups. I mean, that was part of the reason we weren't at the table in an assertive enough way. So formed the pool of consumer champions with the hope of getting money for the next level of funding, which is going to be prevention, early intervention, which would mean a stigma campaign. Also want to try and get a Soteria house going. I think you're probably familiar with that.
Like a drug-free alternative, some kind of sanctuary place. Yep. Lauren Mosher had done that. Yep. In San Jose.
Yeah, so we wanted to get those two programs. So we really organized. We organized the POCC. We got people on the committee to decide who was going to get the money. We started wearing our yellow T-shirts and going to all the hearings. Our first one was to try and get the stigma. We hoped to get $750,000 for a stigma campaign that would go to consumer rent organization. So we organized, we had conferences, we went to all the things, and at the end we got $950,000 to go to peers. We had to give up the Soteria house. That was a problem, but there's no way the county was going to fund two major consumer stuff. So we got that. And then the next thing was workforce development. So each time we're forming the POCC, more and more members were having our first conference, in which Gail Steele and Linford Gale and Sally, who was working for the California Network at the time, were keynote speakers. We had maybe 80 or 90 people attend. We had about 100 members after 4 or 5 months. We now have over 1,600. And so the second one with the workforce development, we were successful. We had the advisory group that gave input to the county. Over half were consumers. We had 500,000 that was going to go to the Alameda Network. Unfortunately, the county only gave them 200,000 or 300,000 the first year, and nothing since. But with the peer certification, we hope that will change. So anyway, that's how the POCC got started, trying to get money for consumer rent organizations.
What do you think was the crucial reason that this giant ballot initiative, this Robin Hood taxation initiative, which was intended to put money into the most effective, most progressive, most innovative, cutting edge programs about mental health, why is it that that was thwarted?
We may have a little difference of opinion, but I think it's okay to agree to disagree. We'll get to that story sometime. It was actually appointed by the lieutenant governor to be on the task force for the seriously mentally ill. Now, unfortunately, I didn't get onto that till the second or third meeting. I tried to get him to change it to transfer the committee for the comically mentally ill, but I wasn't successful because I think I've been taking life too seriously every time since I've been on that. But basically, it really set up these full service partnerships. And we actually traveled to 6 states to come up with a progressive way to have a full service partnership. And of course, I pushed for one that would be entirely consumer rent, but almost every full service partnership has peers on it, but that's also compromise. So I don't know if we agree or disagree, but I do think it's helpful to have programs that help people get housing and employment.
Yeah, I mean, definitely that money went to a lot of good places, but there was also a way of, like you said, I mean, we saw some of the professional just sort of rewrite their job descriptions and rewrite their contracts and their budgets, and now they just move in and grab the money, even though they have no history in the recovery movement. They have no history among the patient. Yeah,
exactly. You're 100% right. You're 100% right on that. That's what happens. You know, there's a new pot of gold there, and they're going to get that pot of gold, even if they have to lie in their statements, you know, that they're recovering. I mean, there's a lot of BS there. That's for sure. Big pile of BS.
Yeah. One of the things that's been, and maybe Dina can talk about this as well. I mean, in California, there's a huge influence in the U.S. politics in general. A lot of the first wave of new ideas come from California. A lot of the impact of social movements starts in California, whether it's the environmental, civil rights. But one of the things that we've seen is that in the way that the peer services are being implemented in California, there was this redefinition of peers to not just say, well, you know, these are people who have been patients in the systems, who have lived experience of being receivers of mental health services, but we're also going to include their family members in that definition.
It's gotten worse than that. Will. Well, let me just say, and I don't know if Dina feels comfortable with this, but I think I remember my skepticism about PrEP and how well that might turn out for her. I was worried for her being involved with PrEP, actually.
This is the early psychosis, because this is also one of the big innovation that's kind of gotten twisted a bit.
And this was a program that was funded through the Mental Health Services Act dollars. And so, yes, my position was only created because of the Mental Health Services Act. They were told that they must hire people with lived experience. But yeah, when that translated into the job that I was actually, told to do, was using nothing of my personal lived experience. It was pretty much just a marketing job. I was doing graphic design and creating the logos and doing presentations to other providers about how to make referrals to our program. And it was only over many years of reading the original intentions of the Mental Health Services Act and advocating, then saying, like, pointing to, like, hey, it's supposed to be a more progressive program than this. And so just advocating that they start providing a peer support group and facilitate the peer support group and helping to try to evolve the program into being more progressive. But yeah, it was something that I spent a lot of years there trying to make changes to something that I honestly wish that the Soteria House program had been funded instead.
Which should not have been such an uphill, because you fought, that's one of the things you've been doing for many years, is really fighting the same fight that Jay's been fighting, trying to get the money directed in the right direction. But it should not have been an uphill battle because of the way that it's an unusual situation, because there's a ballot initiative that actually goes before the voters, and the voters sign off on it. They say, yes, we want this. And then it's not just something that's lost in the bureaucracy or the policy at the statewide level. It's actually what the voters agreed to. And then it still wasn't able to be put in the direction that it needed to be put in.
One of my first public statements, actually in 1974, when I went to the Capitol and gave a speech, at that point, mental health funding, you had to get it every year. There wasn't any designated funding. You had to go back and lobby every year. So that year, Reagan was cutting the mental health budget $26 million. And I was asked to speak from a consumer's perspective. And I can remember saying that Ronald Reagan's delusions of grandeur have matured to the point that now he wants to, this is 1974, delusions of grandeur have matured to the point that now he wants to be president of the United States. And the way he's going to do this is show he's some kind of economic wizard that's going to cost those of us with mental health issues our lives. And I can remember saying the major decisions that are made by individuals that affect mental health care are made by elected officials, bureaucrats who are too far removed from the system to know the effects of their mistakes on the human beings that they're trying to help. Their decisions aren't based on the concern for the individual, but based on the need to power, money, and maintain the status quo. So what you have going so much is so much of the bureaucracy maintaining the status quo. It's very hard to overcome that.
Well said. And Jay, is there a question that you'd want us to ask or a direction that you want us to go?
I kept changing the subject, but I'd like to see us go back to, we covered a lot of it, but it'd be nice to go back to 1976 or 1980 or somewhere around there is where we left off.
Okay. Yeah. Dive right in.
Okay. Well, so we talked about mental health consumer concerns. In 1979, CAFT had a demonstration against the mental health directors demanding that Governor Brown appoint consumers to be on the state Citizens Advisory Council. And so I actually benefited from that. A woman named Judy Greenwald. In 1980, we were appointed by Governor Brown to be on the state Citizens Advisory Council. State Citizens Advisory Council was the main body that was advisory to the legislature, Department of Mental Health, and the governor on mental health issues. 1980, we designated 1981 as the year of the consumer. That meant that all the meetings that were devoted to hearing about the public mental health system was devoted to hearing the consumer perspective and somewhat the family perspective, although the consumer perspective predominated. So at the end of that year, the consumer, we had a report. There's actually 400 people that attended one of the last meetings of that CAC meeting, largest meeting they ever had. But anyway, out of that came a report called The Year of the Consumer that had two important recommendations. One was to create a statewide organization, and the other was to have consumer speaks conferences throughout the state. And so at that time, the California Network of Mental Health Clients was formed, and we had all the consumers that attended the Year of the Consumer. We had 40 or 50 people applied to be on the formation of the California network. We brought in one ringer. Sally Zimmer was living in Florida at that time. I met her before, so I asked her if she could, she's moving out to California, I asked her if she would join that group. And so in September of 83, we met and formed the California Network of Mental Health Clients, which was the first statewide organization in the country. And we had quite a statewide presence on legislation, setting up self-help groups, working on cultural diversity, because again, a lot of the movement was just made up of white Anglo-Saxon, not ethnically diverse. And the other major recommendation was to set up consumer speaks conferences, in which we're hoping that counties would have these consumer speaks conferences where they'd have a day where they'd hear from the consumers they want, and then from that first day speak to the people in power to let them know what you wanted. So I was involved with organizing at least 20 consumer speaks conferences throughout the state in those 3 or 4 years after the year of the consumer. And out of that came consumer-oriented groups. Like, for example, Ron Schraber organized the second one in Mendocino County, and a group called Capable was formed. We organized the second one in Contra Costa County. We had a group called Tally, Take a Loving Look at Yourself, that Ron Schraber and others were very involved with. It goes on and on. Those consumer speak conferences were a very good organizing tool to get more momentum going. Keep in mind, before 1977, 78, there was no consumer involvement whatsoever, other than 2 or 3 of us.
Right. This is pioneering stuff that's creating a giant cultural shift, and now the voice of people who've been in the system is completely woven into mental health policy.
Bad and good,
exactly. But this is the beginning of when it started, because there was nothing on the map. Nothing like this had ever been done before, and you had a huge amount of opposition at that time.
We sure did.
I mean, I remember when we did some of the Freedom Center support group work, just in the early 2003, 2004, we would still come up against professionals that would say, wait a second, mental patients can't run their own support group. What are you talking about? What happens if there's no safety, or what happens if there's a crisis? And that attitude now, we look at that and it's like, okay, that we're past that already. But this is the kind of thing that was really to the point in the 70s where you wouldn't even want to listen to a mental patient, because they're ill. They don't how are you gonna it's like asking someone who's a spinal cord injury victim to explain to you surgery for spinal cord. It's absurd. The entire medical model would just completely discount the idea that mental patients, survivors, would have anything to say. And then you guys just broke right through that.
Well, we went through an evolution. In the 70s and 80s, you had the strong medical model. Starting in the mid-80s on, you started getting some psychosocial rehab. Different progressive providers were really challenging the medical model. But in California, we really didn't have the recovery vision until 97. We can talk more about that, because that was one of the things I'm most proud of, was bringing the recovery vision into California. So that was really significant in forming the California network and forming the Consumer Speak Conference. And of course, patient rights, that was the main thing in the 70s and early 80s. And so having the opportunity with mental health consumer concerns to be involved with writing the Doe versus Gallo legislation, we were on the statewide group for that, and also in writing the patient rights regulations. So there was a lot of opportunity mental health consumer concerns had in being on these statewide committees that wrote the laws, plus representing people at hearings and having people like Gene Matulis and Ron Schraber and Pat Risser to be employed by MHCC. We had quite a strong advocacy group. But then in the 2000, after the forming of the network, the next big issue from patient rights to systems change, those were the 2 big issues. And we started getting into consumer rent programs. And that's where in California you had people like Sally Zinman forming the Berkeley Drop-In Center, Howie Hart forming Oakland Independent Support Services, and then, of course, I guess it was program in Baltimore on our own that was the first self-help group, although our contract in 1980 with patient rights was consumer rent contract. We weren't providing this drop-in services type. But anyway, so the next big thing was the drop-in centers and also the psychosocial rehab, starting to push the issues. It's not the medical model, it's employment, it's friendship, it's housing, it's spirituality, it's what's happened to you, not what's wrong with you, what you need. So that whole 80s was a major time of change. And so I just want to mention that. But the next big thing I got involved with, and I think we may have talked about this enough, was in 89 when we wanted the patient have the contract to start training consumers to be providers, and the 3 or 4 year long struggle before we finally got 30,000 from Contra Costa County. Oh, the other thing I should say is the California Institute of Mental Health, which was the main training arm for the mental health directors in California. They're the ones that trained what the programs we're going to do. We got very involved with that and was actually on their board for 8 years. Number of people there that were very supportive for the consumer movement. So and you had people, I don't know if you know Laura Mancuso, she's been incredible. But anyway, in the 90s, as we were pushing for hiring consumers, CIMH took that on as a priority. So MHCC and Sacramento County, we were traveling all over the state to get counties to start having programs to hire consumers and really pushing that issue. So that was like a 7-8 year project from 1989 to 1996 or so to really get the system to start incorporating the value of hiring consumers. So that was a lot of learning, a lot of pushing, and you certainly learned how consumers can be co-opted by the system and the desire to get along with the person that's training them.
Yeah, this had a huge impact because we're talking about changes in California that then catalyzed changes around the rest of the country and combined with also changes already underway in other parts of the country. And then now we're seeing a global international wave of countries, entire mental health systems changing their orientation so that consumer, patient, survivor involvement is part of how mental health services are delivered worldwide. So it's a very dramatic impact that took place as a result of this work.
Yeah. Unfortunately, where you're seeing it not is in the consumer rent programs. I mean, that seems to be what's taking the back step. They're open to having it in their own power base in their own kingdoms, but they're not willing to contract out for it.
Yeah, it becomes instead of becoming peer-run respite, it becomes a respite.
Yeah, like our respite right now, it's not consumer rent. It is. I mean, they hire consumers, but it has a Latino organization that runs it.
That's, I think, the nature of co-optation is that the power relations don't change. What it looks like changes, and who's involved changes, and the words change, and maybe some of the staffing and participation changes, but the power base that is still remains unbalanced. I think that's what makes it co-optation.
So one thing I do want to say, because I mainly been involved in California and locally, but I did have opportunities to be involved nationally, and certainly the person I was really close to was Jackie Parrish, and so I was invited to 4 dialogues, 2 of them on patient rights, 1 on spirituality, 1 on reducing poverty, and 1 on housing. When I went to the housing one in the 80s, I met with the National Association of Mental Health Directors, and they were developing the position paper on supported housing. And when I went to that, again, very little consumer involvement, but Jackie Parrish entered a contract with me through MHCC to survey what consumer rent organizations were doing in supported housing. So I actually wrote a monograph and teamed up with Paul Carling from the Center for Change to write that monograph and involved the 20 or so Consumer Speaks conferences to 20 or so consumer rent organizations that were doing supported housing, and involved Howie the Harp quite a bit. So we did quite a bit to push the idea of supported housing being consumer ran. And then also I was involved in 2 of the 3 patient rights workshops in the early 80s to really move the issue of patient rights at the federal level. And of course, the one I really appreciated was being involved with trying to get spirituality and the role of faith communities. The SAMHSA one on that. And then the last one I was involved with is trying to look at the issues of poverty as a major cause of mental health issues and trying. And of course, we've gotten probably nowhere on that, but at least the other 3, we've made some progress. And then the final thing I was really pleased with to be able to go to the alternative conferences every year, went to 20 of them, and also being on Boston University Advisory Board for Recovery, and then being the keynote speaker at the Alternatives Conference in '89, which I have to admit this, Will, you gave the best Alternatives Conference speech I ever heard.
Thank you. Wow.
It outdid the one I did. It was outstanding. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we didn't plan on you saying that, but I'll take it. Thank you. Thank you, Jay.
Well, it was true. So I really was moved by yours. Yeah.
Well, that was as I remembered. I was just saying, hey, we've got to look at people's lives, and people are being affected by poverty. They're being affected by racism. They're being affected by homelessness, and especially the war on drugs and the prison system. And that's always been, I think, a problem, is connecting the issues and making the point that people need to talk about our lives and what affect our lives, rather than going into these silos of, oh, your job description says you don't work on police issues, you don't work on poverty issues, you don't work on homeless issues, you work exclusively on mental health treatment, rather than saying, wait a second, it's a whole person, their whole life is involved here, and obviously the whole society needs to change, not just some tiny aspect of mental health treatment that is not really going to be able to make a difference if the person hasn't got housing, if the person is in prison, if the person is affected by poverty, if the person doesn't have educational opportunities, if they're making $7 an hour and don't have health care. So
you did an excellent, you covered those issues outstandingly.
Jay, I would love for you to talk about your shirt and some of your buttons.
So my dad was a truck driver, and we didn't put much value in wearing fancy clothes or being color coordinated. But whenever I give a speech, I like to be content coordinated. I like to wear a message. And so today I'm wearing a T-shirt that was actually sold to me by Ray Unzicker. It says, "I'm not a case and I don't need to be managed." And for me, we're first and foremost human beings, and we shouldn't be delegated to a case. To me, I often wonder when they speak of case, are they thinking about the time I was a basket case and I was flying high, or they thinking about the time that I was where I slept 20 hours a day for over a year? And so you have this case management means somebody else is running your life for you, and somebody else is taking charge of telling you what's best for you. And so to me, I want to be my own person. And so that's the main reason why this T-shirt has such an important message for me. I don't want to be managed by anybody. I want to make my own choices. I want to lead my own life. I don't want other people telling me what's best for me. And the buttons should also share that over the years, one of my strengths is I'm a person that collects things. I don't throw things away. So I had over 26 boxes of material from the movement. I had over 100 T-shirts, got all these buttons, got books, got Will Hall's books, got all these books. And so I was pleased that I was able to, at the last 2 years, develop a history of the consumer movement in Alameda County that really reflects statewide and nationally that the county asked me to do. The buttons I'm wearing today is who's the system for? Is the system for consumers? Is it system for the families? Is the system for providers? Is the system for society? To me, the system hasn't always been for us. It's been for these other players. So I wear that button. The other one I wear is shrink resistant, because I try and resist this medical model. So I wear a button that says shrink resistant. And then I have another one that says nothing about us without us. That really talks about the self-help movement and making our own choices. And then I'm wearing a button today that says sing our own song. That refers to when we did this major effort to save our national grant when the providers didn't want to contract and hire peers. We lost that one, but I still wore that button. And then we have recovery vision. It's the one that says recovery from psychiatric is possible. Recovery, new hope for people with psychiatric disabilities. And the other is recovery is real. And the last one I'm wearing today is vote for Proposition 62, which was the Mental Health Service Act. So those are my content wearing buttons today. But I have over 100 buttons, I have one that says 5150 Helen Thompson, all kinds of buttons. Yeah.
Oh, yes. She's one of the arch villains of the California movement. Yeah.
She was. So anyway, so we were kind of talking about getting into the recovery vision. Well, I had a chance to hear about the recovery vision that was going on at Alternatives Conference and heard Bill Anthony's paper where he acknowledged that it was really the writings of Pat Deegan and Essa Lee and Ray Unzicker and one other person I'm forgetting that got him inspired to talk about recovery vision because they wrote their stories about their recovery. And so when I was back at Alternatives Conference, I felt that we needed to do that in California because there was no talk about recovery in 1997. And when I got that job, or Contra Costa County, Donna Wiegand, the mental health director, I asked her, can we try and implement the recovery vision in Contra Costa County? So she actually appointed the director, Bob Moody, and myself to co-chair the recovery task force. And we developed a 30-person group to bring the recovery vision to Contra Costa County. And we started studying what was going on in Ohio, which was probably the first state to try and implement it, and reading the works of the consumer survivors and Bill Anthony. And then we developed a position paper from that and started implementing the recovery vision in Alameda County by having two conferences. First one had Mary Ellen Copeland to talk about rap, along with Dan Fisher. We had over 400 people come to that in Contra Costa County. We also invited the 11 Bay Area counties to also come to that. So we had representatives from all the counties to get them educated about the recovery vision. And then we had a second conference that we had 700 people that focused on spirituality, the various programs that were being implemented in the state around diversity, as well as more around the Full Service Partnership. We had this guy named Mark Reagans from the Village in Southern California, LA. Then we had a third component that was on ethnic diversity, where we had various diverse groups to have a chance to talk about what recovery meant in their culture. So it was quite a conference. And so along with that conference, we set up a wellness recovery center. We set up a library. We did a number of other efforts to implement recovery vision in California. And because I was on the board of directors for the California Institute of Mental Health, I was able to get the California Institute of Mental Health to start a program on getting recovery vision implemented throughout the state. And we were able to have Courtney Harding and Pat Deegan and Bill Anthony come out to California. We were able to have regional workshops throughout the state to promote the recovery vision. And so that momentum, I think, really brought the recovery vision to California, which was one of the things I felt most proud of, the role I had a chance to play in getting people to change their mindset and start looking at what happened to the person and not what's wrong with the person. And that took about 6 or 7 years, to implement that. That's the recovery vision.
Should we keep going with the timeline? Do you want to say what happened next? Or
Yeah, sounds good. So after the recovery vision, I was working for Contra Costa County, and in 2006, I took a job in Alameda County. And you've already heard about how we were able to get the stigma campaign and the hiring consumers going. The other thing that I felt really good about was that Mary Thomas and the deputy director, Barbara Majak, gave me the green light to look at the role of spirituality and faith communities in helping people to recover. So I was able to put together a work group that had David Lukoff on it, had Priscilla Ridgway, had Laura Mancuso, a number of local people, about reflecting various spiritual faith communities. So we wanted to have it be very inclusive. So we had a planning group that met for a number of months that developed a position paper on the role of spirituality and recovery. And then from there, we started implementing it. And we got $300,000 from the state to implement recovery vision, to get spirituality and the role of faith communities implemented throughout the state. We did a survey of family members, mental health directors, consumers, probably had at least 1,000 people participate in the surveys. We were able to get a statewide group to start implementing it. In Alameda County, we started having work groups and trainings on spirituality, and started meeting with faith communities, and started addressing spirituality as its own source. So that was a good thing that happened in Alameda County. And of course, we had the Mental Health Service Act passed, so we were able, with the pool of consumer champions, having 13 committees that include every ethnic diversity, LGBTQ, vocational, trauma, a number of work groups, and we were able to get stipends. I was very pleased that the county would give $80,000 a year to pay people stipends. They gave $120,000 to have people go to conferences, so we would regularly go to the statewide network conference and the alternatives conference and the CASO conference. They gave $40,000 for food. So we were well plenished in terms of resources to pull this off. And so with the Mental Health Service Act, in our efforts, we were able to get a closer look at co-occurring disorders in combination with mental health disorders. We were able to get to look at trauma. We were able to get a look at a number of issues through the POCC. And plus, we were able to hire an incredible team. I've had a chance to hire Sally Zimmerman 3 times now. So third time was she came to work for Alameda County, along with Sharon Keene and several local people. And each committee gets a stipend paper, so that's cool. Each POCC committee gets a stipend, so that enables people to have some incentive, because again, a lot of people, the resources are so important, because we're all living in low poverty, that it's helpful to have that. And then since I left, I kind of retired in 2006. I actually left when Barbara Majak left. I left the night she retired. So much of what I was successful in doing in Alameda County was because I had the support of Barbara Majak. And I knew when she left, it would go downhill. I mean, for me, it would go downhill because I didn't have the relationship that I had with her. She gave me everything I wanted, well, not everything, but it was pretty good. A lot of the administration was very jealous of me, getting more things than they were getting. Kind of kidding a little bit. But anyway, so after I retired, Katerra still wanted me to be a consultant. So at that time, Sally and I were hired as consultants, and I worked on trying to stop outpatient commitment. There was a big effort in Alameda County led by a board of supervisor member to start outpatient commitment. Unfortunately, we weren't successful in that. They have it on a basis in Alameda County now. Next thing Tara wanted me to do was work on trying to get more. We had this peer certification bill, and we had an assemblyman that was authoring it, and we needed to support that assemblyman and get peer certification going in California. And so she asked me to organize an effort to get hiring consumers more recognized in the Bay Area. So we again reached out to all the Bay Area counties and try to get them moving on that. Unfortunately, Governor Brown vetoed it, and thank goodness Newsom finally signed it this year. And then after the hiring consumers, Katerra entered into a contract to have me work on the history of the consumer movement, which I've been doing for 2 years. And then after I left that in June, I got real inspired by Black Lives Matter and the tragic death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the massive protests to realize this is probably the best opportunity we'll ever have to remove police from being the first responders, and came up with a group, and Dina's on it. And we'll, of course, Compassion Not Cops are on it. Really appreciate that. We have 9 tasks we're working on. It's going incredibly well, I think. I'm interested to know what Dina thinks. She did an outstanding job talking about a post-crisis and training and what needs to be done to have peer providers in that role, as well as the role of being on the actual main mobile crisis team. So that's my life.
Okay. If you look back over your entire 50-something year career with all the, what do you think is the most inspiring moment that you remember? Is there a particular moment that stands out, or a story that really just grabs you in terms of inspiring you of the importance of this work or the effectiveness of this work?
I appreciated Howard Levine apologizing to me. I mean, that stands out to me.
Yeah.
I appreciate the movement. I mean, I appreciate meeting people of like minds that had the same experiences to me and were willing to fight for it. I mean, this was a powerful group of people that were going to keep persevering and going. It takes a lot of hard work, and I think a lot of movement people and what they've been through. And it's hard to accept how unfair our society is in terms of the people that are not getting their fair share of the American dream. One thing I did do that was important to me was get somewhat politically involved. And so in '84, when I went to that meeting of Justin Dart and met with all the leaders of all the disability groups, the major idea that came out for that was to try and get involved politically on the presidential race.
What year was that?
1984.
Reagan's re-election.
And so I actually became a delegate for Reverend Jackson.
The Rainbow Coalition.
Yeah, and I went there under trying to represent the 30,000 Americans with disabilities.
I think that must have been in '88 though.
No, it's '84. He ran twice.
He ran. That's right. He ran. Okay, so I was involved in '88. You were involved in '84. Okay, that makes sense.
And so I went and I got elected. So I was actually on the ballot, because that's the way they had the people that were pledged to candidates. They didn't have the candidate's name. They had the people, they mentioned who they were pledged for. So I was actually on the ballot in Oakland, and the organizing of that, and to be able to introduce Reverend Jackson at the Center for Independent Living, and have him spend a night with us at a disabled person's apartment. That was moving to see the political stuff. That's another thing. Finally, get some recognition that people can recover and live a full life, and they don't have to be the role of mental patient.
That's really remarkable. I didn't know that you were involved with the Rainbow Coalition in '84. But to me, that's really the heart of this work, is connecting all these issues and getting the disability rights folks and the psychiatric survivor world to really understand that the roots are in multi-issue and multi-group coalitions, and trying to really connect all these different things: the anti-racism, the anti-poverty work, and the way in which the society is spending all this money on war that it should be actually investing. So that's really inspiring. I'm glad. Thanks for telling us about that.
Well, it also gets back to what I said earlier. The major decisions are made by elected officials who are too far removed to see their mistakes, and we have to do the hard work of trying to connect with them. And that's why 2 of our 9 tasks are based on legislation and removing the police. We have to do that, or we're not going to be successful.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That's the direction we need to go. Dina, is there any other questions that you wanted to ask before we maybe we're heading towards wrapping up? I don't know. Do you want to bring in some more questions or thoughts?
Yeah, there's two questions or thoughts that I have, but I'll start with one. So, Jay, something I've always seen about you is this leadership style that you have and all the work that you have done, where it's not only your personal work that you're bringing, but you are looking at reaching out and lifting other people up. Like, you really get to know other people and see their strengths, their skills, and help mentor them along the way, and even provide opportunities for them to get involved. And so it's really a leadership style where you're sharing the power that you have. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk about that.
Well, it gets back to the values of our movement, the values of recovery, and the values of spirituality. It's important to meet people where they're at. It's important that they have choice. It's important that you're doing what they want. So I've always tried to have people be involved with things they want to be involved with. For example, in the Office of Consumer Empowerment, we had certain tasks that we had to do to change the system, but we always asked, what's the task you're most passionate about? What do you want to work on? And so we always would have in our action plan something that was really important to each staff. And each person has kind of their passion. And for me, I've always needed somebody. I can't do this on my own. I've always needed a team. Susan's been my main partner. I often say I'd be gravely disabled without Susan. There's so much that I don't know how to do. I've been a one-horse pony. I know mental health, but I know very little else. And so I recognize that I need people, and to do that, involving them and empowering them and doing it as a team, it's caused me, in some ways, that's the way I have to do things, is by involving, empowering, and helping people to feel they're doing what they want to do. Let them do what they want to do, and to be flexible and changing. There's 1,000 ways of doing things. I usually find my ideas are wrong until I steal them from somebody else. I'm teasing a little bit, but I hear what other people have. They have better ideas than I have. I'm really not that bright. I just borrow things from other people. So that's what I do.
Well, I think it's also, I think Jay's also giving one of the unspoken answers, which is your tremendous humility about what you do, Jay. I think that's a big part of your leadership style.
Well, let's thank the mental health system for that one. They taught me to have such a low self-image. I still have a lot of doubts. Oh, no. So maybe there's something positive that maybe
you turn that in a positive direction. Okay.
And I just know, through the pool of consumer champions and how many people you have reached and affected and really changed their lives, given them opportunities to, have a seat at the table. Truly nothing about us without us. So teaching people how to advocate, how to, go for jobs, working in mental health, and just get that job experience that many of us, don't have because we've been stuck in the mental health system.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Yeah, I know so many people are very, very thankful to you. And I'm just wondering if there's any hopes that you have for this large network that you have created.
Well, my hope is that we find some issues that we're so passionate about that will bring people along. I've been really impressed with the demonstrations, the volunteerism that people are showing now in this country, and hope that the consumer movement will get on board with that, and hoping, whether it's removing police or ending poverty. There's just so many issues that we have so much to contribute to, and we're the ones in many ways facing the worst ramifications of all the horrible things that are done to the people that are disadvantaged. So I hope that we'll rise to the occasion. I feel like I'm seeing that. And I have a lot of hope for the youth. I feel like, I think back when I first got started in this, I was like 22, 23. So I'm feeling that the youth are the ones that see the problems now are more idealistic, more passionate about it, are willing to work hard on it. So that's a hope for me, and hoping some of the providers that have been around so long will keep retiring. I think we should have an early retirement for the providers that have been working for more than 30 years.
Jay, do you have any advice for anybody who might be, might have been doing this for a while, and then they worry about they start to burn out, or they start to lose their inspiration?
I don't think you burn out myself when you have a passion for them. It takes hard work, perseverance, patience. Don't give up. I mean, you're in it for the long haul. I mean, if I look back 50 years, I can see tremendous change. If I look back a year, I see it's going backwards. So you have to look at history in the long term and not the short term. And you have to ally with people that are on your side. I really do believe we have to be open to having people that will hear us, try and implement what we want, and not have their own agendas for building their own kingdoms or whatever. But I do think you have to involve family members as well. Our son has been going through a rough time. He was in Napa for 15 months, recently got out a year ago. Susan and I went to a family support group to hear the pain and the struggles the family members are going through, even though from my viewpoint, they have many of the wrong answers. I mean, it makes me sick to hear that kind of thinking, but they have a rough time.
Yeah, that's the belief that, people don't know what's best for themselves. They have agnosia there. Yeah.
Yeah. What kind of hope can you have for people if they don't know they have?
Yeah, I really see the same thing. I mean, I think that the mental health system treats people who are diagnosed terribly, and it also treats the families terribly. It sort of, the families are left picking up the pieces. And that you're right, often they don't have the right answers, partly because they're being fed the wrong answers. Yeah.
Yeah, by the psychiatrists and the pharmacy companies. It's sad to see that.
Yeah, and Jay, what are some of the biggest victories that you see? We've talked about how there's ways that the system has changed, there's ways it's gotten better, maybe in some ways the situation with psychiatry has gotten worse, but what do you think are the big victories and big changes that you see?
Patient rights. Back when I went through, you had no rights. Now, again, it was the late 70s and early 80s, tremendous changes in the patient rights law. Again, I'm still hopeful. We still got a long ways to go. We've seen backward step with outpatient commitment. I think I shared with you the greatest way of removing police is to change the LPS Act that no longer gives them authority. I don't think we'll pull that off. And then after that, systems changed. When I was involved, there's only 2 or 3 consumer survivors in the state that were involved in trying to change the system. The other thing was the self-help groups, the forming of self-help groups that we can do our own services, we can provide our own services. I do think the place of the psychosocial rehab, looking at employment, housing, education, having friendship, dealing with poverty, hiring consumers, recovery vision, stigma campaigns, looking at trauma, looking at what's happened to the person, said what's wrong with them, spirituality. I think all these things we mentioned have been the things that I've found the most rewarding, and seeing that we've made steps forward. And some of them are smaller steps than the other ones, but still there's been progress.
Great. Dina, is there more you want to add, or other questions as we wrap up? Or Jay, you have any other final thoughts or anything? Or
no, I think I don't know. I thought my life was more fuller than 2.5 hours. But no, I'm just joking.
Jay, I wanted to go back to, you had mentioned this altered state that you were in after, being on the plane after the KKK rally, and how God said to you that you fulfilled your destiny to me. And wondering if you can talk about that time, that altered state that you were having.
Well, it seems like every time I have an altered state, there's a major change in my life. Spirituality is involved, going in a new direction. So back in 80, for example, I was trying to get mental health consumer concerns to get a contract to be the patient rights advocate. In 1980, we finally got the contract for Contra Costa County. It was also the year that I got appointed to the Citizens Advisory Council It was also a time where I felt I wasn't that spiritually strong. I was kind of compromising. I feel like, again, I'm reading a lot of this Science and Mind now, where you talk about the Spirit of God is within each person. We have these thoughts that can help us to get on the right direction. And if I'm too much in the world, if I'm too much working on things that just deals on world, things are wrong with the world and not my spirituality, I get out of balance. So being out of balance by 1980, I feel I was ready for a spiritual renewal. When I go to National Tennessee and see the largest KK rally in 50 years, and a number of African Americans in our training, start rethinking about what occurred for me around racism, and then having a conference where I usually have to get feedback that I'm doing well, and I say, did I do okay? Did I do okay? With that conference, I really felt I did a good job. So here I'm on this plane and hearing the voice of God saying I fulfilled a commitment to him. And then I started 40 days of going through this altered state. And that time I was working at a LISO house. That was a mental health program. They made me take time off. It was interesting. In 94, when I went through an altered state, I was still able to work for mental health consumer concerns. But I would really get way out there. I mean, I would see not only my spiritual beauty, but I'd see the darkness inside of me and the things I needed to change. We had a fireplace in our home, and I would build a fire in the fireplace, and I would see the whole history of mankind going on the fire like a movie projector, have all kinds of altered state experiences like that. Remember one time, I guess this was in 1980 or 76, when I was in altered state, I remember going to Capwell's, and it was around Christmas time, and they were, Santa Claus was late or something, and I told them I was Santa Claus. And I can remember looking at this skeleton, this mannequin, and all of a sudden it was dressed and then it wasn't dressed. And I can remember being outside my body and looking down on my body. I mean, the altered states are quite something. I don't know if that gives you a little picture of it.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
I can remember I was a jogger. I would go jogging, and I think if where I jogged was protecting that land from having an earthquake, had this power that was preventing earthquakes. And then I would see a police officer harassing what I interpreted as harassing a woman, gave me a ticket. So I would go up to her and harass the cop for stopping this woman for giving her a ticket. Of course, I was running a lot, so I outran the cop. So I had all these experiences that were quite something.
Well, it comes back to what we were saying in the beginning about feeling like things are moving through you, and there's synchronicities, and things are brought together for a reason, and you were in the right place at the right time because you needed to be there.
I have a little trouble with Christianity. I was involved with that for quite a while, but I believe the Spirit of God is in every human being, and each person has that spirit within them, and it's up to them if are they going to be in touch with the Spirit, or they can be in touch with the world, the things the world calls you to do to get you not in touch with Spirit. So I'm a strong believer that our thoughts and our spiritual can really govern us. That's kind of what I'm coming to now, thanks to Renee Ramchar. She's got me reading this book by Knowles. Everybody has to have their choice in what they believe or not. I don't mean to proselytize on you right now, but yeah.
But looking back over, all that you've accomplished, and, like the people that you've met, the situations you've been in, and that spiritual view of being guided.
So meeting you, Dina, was my spirit, not my hard side of me, seeing you, meeting you. I met you the most, when it's based on love and hope and concern and wanting to make changes, that to me is spirit working.
Yeah. You helped to organize this conference on spirituality. And so Michael Cornwall was a speaker, Cardam Harmon was a speaker, you were there, and I was there. And out of that, us all meeting right after that, we created the Bay Area Mandala Project.
Exactly.
So this one moment in time, where we all come together because of something that you organized, and then all of the things that come out of that. You have touched so many people.
Well, thank you for saying that. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Been in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
I sometimes used to say, I know what it's like to be in the wrong place, getting the wrong kind of help from the wrong people in the wrong places. In the last 40 years, I've been in the right places with the right people, getting the right kind of support I need.
Beautiful.
Well, should we wrap it up, or is there anything else you wanted to add?
Well,
Jay,
I don't want to end early. I was planning to be on until, one thing, I'm very obsessive compulsive. I have to stay on until 5 o'clock now. No, I'm just kidding with you.
We can stay on. We could just wrap up the interview.
Can you sing a song?
Sing a song.
Madness.
Happy birthday, Jay.
No, I was hoping a Madness song like Dr. Freud, Dr. Freud.
I don't know this.
Go?
You don't know that?
Psychiatrist told me.
Oh my
but I was
goodness!
Out of my head.
I don't know this. What is this Madness song?
Gene Matoulis. Do you know who Gene Matoulis is?
No, I don't.
No.
Oh my God. She was very involved in the movement in the 70s and 80s. She was in the hospital as an adolescent. She became a lawyer, worked for protection and advocacy, but she had a gift for singing and composing songs. She didn't compose the Freud song, but she used to sing it. But she composed songs on Howie the Harp when he passed away, on throwing away the chains, on patient rights advocacy. Anyway, to Jet Miller, who was killed by shock treatments, and that. She's written some incredible, powerful songs. But one song she used to sing was at every Consumer Speaks conference. Jeannie and I would do a lot of them together, and she had this Freud song. It goes, "Oh, I can't sing it, but oh, Dr. Freud, how we wish he had been otherwise employed. For such the circumstances have enriches the finances of the followers of Dr. Freud." It goes in and talks about Adler and Jung, and then it ends up with, although the three people have departed, so the followers they started, they still make great riches by pulling electric switches. Oh, how we wish he had been otherwise employed. Have you heard the Hug song? You know the Hug song?
No.
Yeah, I don't know that one. That's another good song about getting hugs on the wards instead of medications.
Absolutely.
Anyway, well, that was interesting.
Jay Mahler, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on Madness Radio, joining myself and Dina Tyler. Thank you both for being here on Madness Radio.
Thank you so much, Jay. Thank you, Will, for putting this interview together.
Well, thank both of you. It's an honor, and it's an honor to do with people you have the highest regard for. So I really appreciate being able to share with two people I trust.
You've been listening to an interview with Jay Mahler with myself, Will Hall, and Dina Tyler. Jay Mahler is a longtime leader and organizer with the psychiatric survivor movement and has been hugely impactful in changing the mental health system around the U.S. and worldwide. Big thanks to Oddball Magazine for help with the production of this episode. Check out oddballmagazine.com. That's all the time we have on Madness Radio. Thanks for tuning in.